seasoned agronomist.
Yeah.
Reading that, man.
Good morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and kick things off here on Ask the Agronomist this morning. We've got a full agenda. I'm going to slide the screen over a little bit. And I was kind of warning Adam, if we get much interaction this morning from our live audience, which we always hope we do, we get some good questions and we spend some time on questions, and I actually get through. I'll show you. Here's a little prelude of the list. I've got a fairly long list of things this morning that I would like to cover, and we may actually run a little bit long this morning. And I know Jennifer's out there somewhere cringing because she's always coaching me that people like things to be short and sweet and to the point and brief, and nobody wants to sit through an hour-long video. But we may give you an hour and 10-minute long video this morning. Perhaps we'll see how we go here. So again, welcome to Ask the Agronomist. Appreciate our live audience participating in the chat. So if you want to get logged in, log in with your YouTube account or your Gmail account, any Google-based email account. Will enable you to live chat in your questions, and we always give priority to those questions that come in live. Thanks, Adam. We forgot to turn our lights off here in the Nutrien Macomb studio. So thanks again to Nutrien for letting us borrow their conference room here south of Macomb. Very wet right here in this area, and as you go southwest of here towards Rushville, where Adam hailed from here this morning, gets wetter. So a lot of people picked up rain a couple nights ago. Some places had nothing. Some places had a tenth. Some places had a nice 5, 6, 7 tenths, and some places had 4 inches plus. And that's kind of been the theme here this spring. We've had really an ample amount of moisture that has, we haven't necessarily been flooded everywhere, but there's just been a lot of days it was too wet, too windy, too something to be in the field getting much done. And some areas have had some pretty ferocious rains, hailstorms, tornadoes. It's just been a very active weather pattern here this spring. And when July gets here, we'll be thankful for the moisture. Right now, it would be nice to settle this weather pattern a little bit through the month of June. Let these crops root down, let things breathe, let the sprayers roll. A lot of spraying to be done in the next 3 weeks. And so we need a lot of good working days in the next 3 weeks to get caught up on stuff. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we get through the program here this morning. So hopefully you're feeling good about how your crops look. My guess is, if you're a little bit frustrated with the slowness of your crop development, slowness of your soybean emergence, the amount of herbicide symptom might maybe need to be replanted, or crusted soils that maybe cause you to replant soybeans. If those kind of things are frustrating you, you are in good company, and you're not alone. A lot of us are dealing with the same things, and the nature of this spring being kind of on the wet side, kind of on the cold side. There's just a lot of stress out there, and we'll talk about a lot of those things that we're seeing in the fields as we get through the program here today. So, again, chat in your questions if you got them, and barring any questions, I'll start working on my list here. So I think the first thing on the list I want to touch on is maturity switches. So I know in Adam's territory, there's been a few acres that have been switched, from one crop to another. There's been a few folks that had some real full season corn planned that have gotten uncomfortable with the idea of planting 116 plus day corn in June. I've done it before, do it somewhere every year. Last year on June 4th, we planted a demonstration plot at Monmouth that went all the way up to our 120-day 70-27, planted June 4th in Warren County. There's growers in Warren County that don't think you can raise 120-day corn in Warren County, period, let alone planted on June 4th. And it matured before a killing freeze. So, you can still plant, 116-day corn in early June, and it will mature, and it will yield. It will probably yield better than switching to an earlier maturity hybrid. But, you know, at some point, the harvest timing and the grain moisture at harvest becomes a concern. And if you feel that you need to switch out a hybrid for something earlier, my coaching would be, don't radically change the maturity of your hybrid. You know, if you want to go from 116 day down to a 110 or 112, just to buy yourself a little more time, get yourself a little more acceptable harvest moisture. I don't have a problem with that. Where I get concerned is when guys, you know, make a radical change and they're planting late and they want somebody to find them some 100-day corn. 100-day corn was not bred for Central Illinois. And it sure as heck was not bred for Central Illinois to pollinate in August because it got planted in June. So you're generally better off to, from a yield perspective, to stay with the fullest season product you can get away with in both corn and soybeans when you're planting late. Now, soybeans are different than corn in that they are, you know, photoperiod driven. And if you plant an early bean late, it's going to essentially start to flower very soon after it emerges out of the ground, because as soon as it comes up, it's already trying to trigger that plant to begin flowering. And so if you talk to a grower from, say, far southern Illinois, where double crop is more common, there are guys in southern Illinois that will plant group twos in April, planting early beans early. But that same guy that's planting group twos in April, if he's double cropping, he's probably planting late fours for double crop. So you generally, the recommendation is to, you know, the later it gets with soybeans, the fuller season you want that soybean to be. So I get uncomfortable planting group twos in June. I would never recommend a group two at a double crop timing. And so typically, you know, I'd recommend in southern and central Illinois, if you're double cropping after wheat, or if you've just got some very late beans to plant, you know, I'd like to see a late group three is a nice compromise. It's not so late that it's going to get froze off, full enough season that you're going to get enough growth. You get less growth from late planted soybeans. They start to flower earlier. So they are basically in the reproductive and vegetative growth stages at the same time. And the reproductive stage takes all the energy. So that plant is putting energy into flowers and pods, which is what you want it to do. But that's at the, you know, sacrifices growth. You get fewer main stem nodes on those late planted soybeans. And the earlier maturing that late planted soybean is, the less growth you're going to get. The earlier it's going to start to flower. Now it is going to mature earlier as well. And that's what everybody's always worried about when they're planting late. And the reason the temptation is there to plant an early product is they're always worried about that killing freeze. Well, what happens if I get an early freeze? Or what happens if it doesn't mature in time? And there is a trade-off there, because if you plant a group 2 soybean in late June or early July, I guarantee you that even if we have an early freeze, that plant's not going to get froze off. I can also guarantee you it's going to be about 8 inches tall when you harvest it, and it's going to yield about 10 bushel. And it would have yielded more had it been a late group 3 versus a group 2. So if you could plant an early 4 if you want to in July, get even more growth out of it, get even more yield potential out of it. But then you are starting to risk, you know, if we get any kind of an early freeze, they might not be, you know, completely mature. But generally speaking, if you're planting late, stay with the fullest season product that you feel you can get away with, and don't worry as much about the harvest date and the harvest moisture. You know, you're going to do those last, regardless of what product you plant, most likely. And probably by the time you get done with everything else, you know, those late planted fields are going to be at a harvestable stage, and you're not going to be sitting around twiddling your thumbs in the fall waiting on those late planted crops to get mature. The question I often get is, well, what if I'm planting part of a field, replanting part of a field, and I want to be able to harvest that field all at the same time, and I want to try to match up the maturity of the crop? So So that's a fairly common desire on people's parts, is if they're replanting a field that was 115-day corn and they're only replanting 25% of the field and they want to harvest it all at the same time, they'd like to plant 105-day corn out there in that 115-day so that they can roll through that, in one pass at harvest. And I get that for logistic reasons, why it's a pain to come back and do those areas that you replanted later. That does add a lot of, logistical headaches to harvest. Just be aware when you do that, you're going to sacrifice some yield for convenience. Same thing with soybeans, even more so with soybeans. If you try to plant an early bean so that they mature at the same time as the full season bean that you planted early in the same field, it's going to be hard to hit that just right. I mean, nobody's going to be able to tell you, okay, you need a 2.6 to mature on the same day as that 3.8 that you planted in April. That's just a wild ass guess, basically. So more than likely, they're not going to mature at the same time anyway. And if you plant that really early bean late, it's just not going to yield very well. So I'd stay with the full season thing, full season bean planted late, and just come back and cut the rest of that later. It's a little easier to do that with beans than it is with corn anyway. So Adam, something you'd like to add?
Well, I would just add to it that, a lot of times people don't get to their beans the moment they're ready to cut.
Yes.
Either, so
yep.
That's usually not as big of a concern, especially if it's not the first field you want to try to cut. Maybe it's a bigger concern if it's the field that's farthest from the farm. There's different logistical things to take into consideration. But Merle just typed in a question. It was a great question, pertains to this exact
He's always
situation.
good for great questions.
I know, he's good. He's great. He said last fall he was reading a couple articles about manually early termination of soybeans via spraying to try and kill them, and he wanted to know what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, so we've played around with that, and here's the idea behind that practice, and I am a little bit enthused about the idea behind the practice. Now, making it work in the real world is something that we've got more work left to do. But typically with soybeans, they are physiologically mature, and the grain is ready to harvest long before you're ever able to get that green, chewy plant through the combine efficiently. And it's hard to be, it's really hard to cut beans the first time they're 13%. Now, maybe on the second or third time they're 13%, you can hit the timing just right and cut some 13% beans. But typically, the first time they hit 13, 14%, some moisture that you'd like to cut them at, the plant's still too green, too wet to be harvested. So we have been playing around with a defoliant, basically. So if you wait, you got to wait until they're physiologically mature. If you do it too early, you're hurting your yield, because one of the components of yield in soybeans is seed weight. And if you terminate that crop before it's physiologically mature, which is a little bit of a challenge in beans because not every seed on the plant matures at the same time, and not every bean in the field is at the same stage of maturity. So if you do it too early, you're going to cost yourself some yield. If you get the timing just right, I think you could maybe dry the plant down so that the plant dries as fast as the grain, and so that you could roll through that field when that grain is 13 and a half, 14%, maybe 2 weeks earlier than you otherwise could. And we could be more timely with our harvest. We could get an earlier start on beans. And I think we could increase the yield potential of soybeans if we could get them out of the field earlier, before that plant starts to deteriorate, before they've ever dried down to 9% in the field. If you harvest soybeans at 8 or 9%, you're losing a ton of yield. You've got more shatter loss. You've got 4 or 5 bushels of lost yield just in the weight of the water that would be in the grain that you're losing because they're too dry. But leaving them out there, waiting for a rain, letting them, get wet again, and then trying to catch them on the way back down, that can be risky from a, delayed harvest standpoint. You want to get across the acres. You want to get things done. Sometimes when you're waiting for that rain to get some moisture back into your beans, it rains for a month. And then you're trying to cut beans in November, which frustrates people. So waiting for a rain to get some moisture back into them can be a risk. if we could get more acres cut on the front side timely, that's what that defoliation process could maybe do for us. But the timing is tricky. There'll be a cost to making that application. So if we can't prove there's additional yield gain there, it's probably not worth it just to get it done earlier. But I think there's probably a yield benefit there as well. But we have in some of our research trials, we've sprayed, a week or 10 days too early and cost yourself 5 bushel of yield because there were too many seeds out there that weren't done growing yet. So you got to make sure that, that plant is mature. You'd want to have, fair amount of yellowing going on in that foliage. You can't spray a green field of beans because if they're green and not even starting to turn, they're still putting yield into those seeds, into those pods. So hopefully that answers your question. And that's something we're going to continue to look at, continue to play with. I know there's a handful of growers around the state that have done some experimenting with that on their own farm. It's become a very standard practice in the seed corn industry and production fields. But if you think about it, they're actually doing it for a couple reasons. One is to control seed size so that we don't end up with a bunch of 65-pound corn that you guys all hate. And it enables us to get a more timely start on harvest. And so they actually are reducing the yield in pounds of those seed fields in some cases by doing that. But in a seed field, the bushels and the pounds aren't where the value is. It's how many seeds are you getting that you can sell. So it's not a big concern if you reduce the grain yield of a seed corn field, because the grain yield of a seed corn field is more or less irrelevant. But in a commercial setting, that's a different story. So good question. So I think we probably addressed that maturity issue. This will be a 2-hour program if I spend that long on my whole list. So we'll try to move things along a little quicker here. So want to give a quick update on seedling blight. I've been out digging up a lot of corn plants and soybean plants, and we are seeing some damping off, some Pythium, some Fusarium seedling blight, other pathogens that cause seedling blight. And really what you want to look for when you're evaluating, the health of those seedlings is in corn, you want to really pay attention to the mesocotyl. So we've got our seed down here at our proper 2-inch planting depth. We got a mesocotyl that comes up to the soil surface. You got your plant above the surface. And then depending on what growth stage you're looking at, you've got some nodal roots starting to come out here about halfway between the seed and the surface of the soil, which is why we want that 2-inch planting depth, because we want this crown to set approximately 1 inch below the surface. So basically what you want to look at here is this mesocotyl from the seed, up to the crown region specifically. And then above that as well, if you're seeing any lesions, so I'm going to switch markers here. So if you see any, like a little section of brown or black there on that mesocotyl, anything that looks discolored, anything that looks, you guys can't really see that very well. I just realized, get that a little closer. Whoops.
The motion
motion sensor and the lights here in the studio kicked on. So Adam's going to dim the lights. Yeah, that is better. Might be better to pull those shades too. Now I see that they're really reflecting off the screen. So look for those areas of discoloration on that mesocotyl. Once this nodal root system is fully developed and mature, this will be 95% plus of the root mass of that mature corn hybrid. And this seed root system and the seed becomes irrelevant. But when that plant is young, that seed root system and that seed is what's feeding that plant. So it's very important. I'm going to say up to at least V6 to have that healthy mesocotyl attaching the seed roots and the seed to that plant. And any sort of, so you can think of this mesocotyl as a soda straw. And all the nutrients and moisture and everything that's coming from that seed and that seed root system that's feeding that young plant is going through that mesocotyl. If you sever that with a rotten spot, or that mesocotyl dies, which can happen in some cases, and basically that plant is forced to live off of that nodal root system before Mother Nature intended it to. That is a huge stress on that plant. That slows the growth of that plant, that its neighbors outcompete it. And if a seedling blight or something interferes with that seedling root system too early, you can turn that plant into a runt, and it can even die in some cases if it's severe enough. But that seedling root system is what's feeding that plant up to, I'm going to say, about V5-ish. These nodal roots start to form about V3, but it takes a while for them to get established and for them to be able to support that plant. And this relates to another thing that I wanted to talk about in corn, is why we're seeing all the yellow areas out in the field, why both corn and soybeans always seem to go through an ugly phase. When that corn plant is transitioning from living off of the seed to living off of its roots. And if anything has inhibited the root development, so maybe a wet soil, maybe a compacted soil, maybe a soil that's just naturally tight because of its clay content, the soil type, cold soils, heavy amounts of residue, maybe you're not utilizing sulfur in your fertility program is another thing that will exacerbate this problem. But basically, when that plant was living off the seed, it had everything it needed. And when you look out across that beautiful field of V1, V2, maybe up to V3 corn, and it's just uniform and it's green, and you got a perfect stand and the color is really nice, and you're patting yourself on the back because you did a really good job. There's no wheel tracks, there's no compaction, there's no small, it's all perfect. And then, it gets a little bigger and it starts to get a little more uneven. And then it gets a little bigger and it's more uneven. And by the time it's like the good parts of the field are like V5, V6, and they're still green and they're still pretty. And you just want to look at that part of the field, because over here it's a little harder to look at because those plants are half the size of the big green plants. Now they're still at the same stage of growth in many cases, or very close to the same stage of growth, but they're 50% the size of the good green part of the field. And the good green part of the field is just growing so much faster. Plants are so much bigger. And you're wondering, what the hell happened to this uniform, beautiful field of corn that I had 2 weeks ago that's now 40% yellow, 40% stunted? I see wheel tracks from my soil finisher. I see wheel tracks from my planter. I can see my pinch rows behind the planter. I can see every place, everything drove in the field. And I couldn't see any of that stuff 2 or 3 weeks ago. That's because those plants are now living off the root system, not off of the seed. And the plants growing in those parts of the field don't have as good a root system. And that root system's not as developed, and that root system's not able to get everything that plant needs. Now, the better your fertility program is, the more available the fertility is in that field, the less you're going to see that. You'll still see it, but it's not going to be as noticeable. Soybeans, similar.
Lance,
question?
Not a question, but I just want to make a comment that I tried to put the link for that article that we had discussed.
Yes.
Leafing out underground and those types of things. I put that in the chat. Hopefully that works for everybody.
Okay.
It's visible.
Okay. So another subject we're going to talk about here in a little bit is we've had a lot of questions this year about what's making the corn leaf out underground. And we've seen a lot of plants that, so you've got your plant growing here, your nice V2 corn plant, let's say, and next to it is one that's all knotted up in a ball because it came out kind of came out twisted up because it was starting to leaf out underground. So we're experimenting with something here today. We tried putting a link to a document that explains leaf out underground in the chat, and hopefully you're able to access that. And if that works, that might be something that we try to do on a more regular basis. If we're talking about a subject and we've got a document that addresses that we can share through the link, we might try to do that. And I would have to give compliments to our growing knowledge group. We've got a group within our technical organization that puts together these bulletins. And that is the best article that I frankly have ever read to explain the reasons why corn leafs out underground. And there are several of them. we'll discuss them here in a minute on Ask the Agronomist, but I just wanted to explain that the document that Adam shared there. So back on seedling blight for a minute. So soybeans are a little bit different than corn, but you want to look at that hypocotyl and that root system on soybeans, and if between the roots and the cotyledons you're finding any brown discoloration on that hypocotyl, especially if it's soft or wet or mushy, that is some sort of a seedling blight, either Phytophthora, Pythium, Rhizoctonia. Hard to say sometimes in the field exactly what pathogen it is, but anything that is working on that plant from its roots up to the cotyledons. The growing points on a soybean, the lowest growing point on a soybean is the point of attachment of the cotyledons. So if that plant gets sick or dies below the cotyledons, it's over, because there's no way for that plant to survive that. If something bad happens to that plant, another thing on my list today is hail. We'll talk about hail damage. If something bad happens to that plant above the cotyledons, that's still a live, healthy plant. That's a plant that can recover and regrow. So keep an eye out for seedling blight in your fields. And if it's been cool and wet where you are, you're more likely to see that. If it's been warm and wet, you can still see that. It would just be maybe Phytophthora instead of Pythium or some other pathogen. If you've been more on the dry side, you're going to be less likely to see seedling blight, but there are several different species of seedling blight. And between all the different species that can cause seedling blight, there's something that fits every environment that we've had. So some of them are a little more active, need really, really wet conditions. Some need cool conditions. Some prefer warm conditions. But we've probably had the right conditions for something about everywhere. Our seed treatments do a good job protecting plants from these pathogens for a period of time. But, even the highest rate seed treatment, best seed treatments on the market are going to give you 3 or 4 weeks of protection from these pathogens. And a lot of these crops have been in the ground for what, Adam, 6 weeks now?
Yeah.
More than that in some cases.
Yeah.
So you might still be able to, you can still see what color the seed was. You can still see the dye that was on the seed treatment, but the dye lasts almost forever. The active ingredients of the fungicides that we're doing the protecting do not last as long as the dye. So just because you can still see what color the seed was doesn't mean your seed treatment's still active, and you just can't get enough product on a seed to make it last, 8, 10, 12 weeks in the field. So at some point that plant's got to fend for itself, because that seed treatment's going to wear off. Okay, so we talked about seedling blight. We talked a little bit about what's causing the ugly phase. Back on the yellow corn for a minute. So areas of your field that are yellowing, that's generally, I'm going to say, everybody talks about nitrogen. Every time corn's not green, somebody thinks it's got something to do with nitrogen. My experience, it's more often sulfur than it is nitrogen. And there's probably plenty of sulfur and nitrogen, out there for that plant. In most cases, it just has too small of a root system, too underdeveloped of a root system to capture what it needs. Now, you can compensate for that by giving it more of the nutrient that it's looking for. I wouldn't necessarily recommend going out, putting on fertilizer to try to, green up the yellow areas of your field. But if you're not currently using sulfur, or if you're using less sulfur than maybe somebody said you should be using, and you're not happy with the color of your corn, maybe that's something to look at for next year, is to get a little more aggressive with your sulfur fertility program. So sulfur is the most cosmetic nutrient there's ever been, even more cosmetic than nitrogen. If you want to make stuff look pretty, put sulfur on it. It will green up almost anything. It'll green up pasture. It'll green up wheat. It'll green up soybeans. It'll certainly green up your corn. So sulfur, it doesn't always increase yield, but it almost always makes it greener. And those yellow areas in the field, that's probably what it's not finding as much of as it would like to have. So we mentioned a bit ago the leaf out underground documents. Let's go ahead and touch on that. So I would say historically, the perception has been that the only thing that causes corn to leaf out underground is either a crust or compaction or chemical damage. Those are 2 of about 5 things that can cause corn to leaf out underground. Another one that has gotten a lot of attention in recent years has been chilling injury. So if you get chilling injury in a seed, we've talked a lot about that, and we've certainly had some conditions this year where it was cold enough. We probably did have some chilling injury. Seed quality can factor into that, the effects of chilling injury a little bit. If you get a seed that is damaged during the germination process by chilling injury, it's more likely to leaf out underground. It's more likely to get disoriented and grow sideways. So if you go out in your field and you've got a V5 plant, a V5 plant, a V3 plant, a V5 plant, a V5 plant, and you're finding a mix of growth stages. If you dig up that V3 plant, I would guess there's a good chance that if you look at the mesocotyl on that, so here's your seed, here's your radical roots, that mesocotyl, which should go like this, might have done one of these. I've seen them before where they do a full 360 around the seed and then eventually start growing up. Or maybe it didn't do a full 360, but maybe it grew this way and then it kind of meandered back that way, and then it finally figured out which way was up and got straightened out. Anything that causes that mesocotyl to grow any direction but due north or straight up is going to delay the emergence of that plant. It's going to weaken that plant. That plant expends a tremendous amount of energy growing in the wrong direction. And those plants are going to be weaker. They're going to be delayed. Those are the plants that might turn into a weed in your field. Those are the plants that are more likely to leaf out underground. Because the other thing that causes leaf out underground is at some point, every plant in a last ditch effort to survive, if it hasn't made it through the surface yet, the last thing it's going to do before it gives up, it's going to say, screw it, I'm just leafing out. And I hope that I find some sunlight when I leaf out. And once that coleoptile starts to split open, so that point of that coleoptile pushing up through the soil can push up through some pretty hard soil. But as soon as it starts to leaf out, it's got no push at that point, and it's just going to crumple up into a accordion looking thing. And it's like trying to push a rope. It's not going to work. And those plants are the plants that leaf out underground. Sometimes when the plant starts to leaf out just slightly before it emerges. So let's say you've got a plant. Here's the soil surface. Here's your plant coming up. Let's say it's just about ready to push through and it starts to leaf out. It might shove itself out through that eventually. And those are the plants that kind of stumble out of the ground. Maybe you see some that come out kind of on a 45-degree angle. That was a plant that was starting to leaf out underground. Maybe you've got a plant that's got 2 leaves that are kind of twisted up and then it gets going. That's a leaf that almost leafed, or a plant that almost leafed out underground. So in addition to compaction or crusting, herbicides. So the herbicides that can be involved in this are your chloroacetamides. So your duals, your harnesses, your frontiers, those type of products, the corn grass herbicides. If there's 2,4-D in the presence of those products, it can cause that to be more pronounced. So you more often see it in no-till if you've got an open seed furrow, if you've got seed that's too shallow, or a furrow that you didn't get closed, or one that's split back open after planting, and you get that 2,4-D and that grass herbicide down in that trench, you're more likely to see those issues. I would say, in the old days when the seed company and the chemical company weren't the same company, the chemical guy could blame the seed for leafing out underground. The seed guy could blame the chemical for leafing out underground. So in the old days, chemical got blamed a lot more than it probably should have. So I don't think that most of the leaf out underground I've seen is herbicide related, But, there is certainly a chance that there could be some of that going on. The other thing that can cause it, and this is something that people don't think about either, is let's say here's our soil surface, and let's say we've got really heavy residue cover, and let's say there's just a little bit of sunlight filtering down there. Is that coleoptile spike's coming up? When it senses sunlight, it thinks it's up. So when it senses sunlight, that releases some hormones and some sets off some reactions in the plant that causes that coleoptile to split and causes that plant to leaf out. If it's not up yet, it's going to leaf out underground. And it's probably still going to push up through. That plant will probably emerge, but that's one of those plants that's probably going to come out kind of malformed, kind of screwed up, kind of twisted up. You're looking at it wondering, well, should I count that plant in my stand count or should I not? Is it going to get itself straightened out and become a contributing member of society? The answer to that is yes. Very, very good chance that it will. Very good chance it'll have just as good a year as the plant next to it. But when they're young and small, they look kind of sketchy at that growth stage. The other thing that can cause this too are clotty soil conditions. So I know none of you ever do anything that creates poor soil conditions, but let's say your neighbor does, and you've got a whole bunch of little clods here covering your seed trench, and there's just a little bit of light filtering down through those clods. Same thing can happen. And some of the worst leaf out underground I've ever seen have been in, so here's your worst case scenario. You've got cloddy soils. So let's say here's the soil surface. Let's say here's your coleoptile coming up through there. Let's say it's ½ an inch from coming up, but this is pretty cloddy up here, and so there's light coming down. So let's say at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a little bit of light filters down through those clods. That plant thinks it's up, and then that night comes a 1-inch rain, and it melts all these clods together. That plant's done for at that point. So some of the worst leaf out underground I've ever seen has been in cloddy soils where the plants are almost up. They think they're up because there's so much sunlight coming down through the clods. And then you get a big enough rain on it that it melts all those clods together and it seals that's like putting the nails in the lid on the coffin on those corn plants out there. So lots of things can cause leaf out underground. A little bit of wireworm damage, if a wireworm or some other insect just nibbles a little bit on the spike of that coleoptiles that's coming up. Anything that causes that spike to start to split is going to make that plant leaf out underground. So I would say a combination of, chilling injury, probably a little bit of herbicide, certainly been some crusting. Those are and then in some cases, maybe we did have some surface conditions that were letting a little bit too much sunlight down beneath the surface of the soil. That's probably more common in no-till, probably more common in cloddy fields. If you've got residue that's mixed into the soil, so let's say in a corn on corn situation where you've done a lot of shallow tillage and the top 2 or 3 inches of your field is a 50-50 mix of residue and soil, conditions like that can allow a little bit too much light to filter down through that top ½ inch of soil, and enough sunlight hits that spike as it's pushing up through that plant mistakenly thinks it has emerged when it actually hasn't yet. And I think that's probably what's contributing to most of the leaf out underground that we've seen this year. But that document does a much better job than I just did of explaining those different factors. So any questions, Adam, have come in while I've been rambling here?
No questions. I just looks like we've got I typed it in the chat. Apparently it's visible now.
Okay.
And we also put it in the link. It really is. You ought to take just 5 minutes or less, whatever it takes to read it. It's a good article. It explains a lot of different avenues of why some corn leafing out underground might happen.
Yep. Okay. Well, the next thing on my list is hail damage. And actually yesterday I was looking at hail damage fields. And as soon as we're done here today, I'm going to look at some more. There actually have been some real small isolated areas where we've had some severe enough hail that there's actually replanting going on of both primarily soybeans, but also a little bit of corn getting replanted due to severe hail damage. And, I don't know that, weather patterns are changing. We've always had severe weather. It does feel like in my geography, I had 2 of the worst hailstorms that I've ever seen in my career last year in my territory. And I've already had 1 this year in my territory that was almost as bad as those 2 last year. So we are seeing some severe hail, and what you want to look for if you're evaluating hail on soybeans. So if a soybean was in the hypocotyl arch stage and it hadn't sprung out yet where the cotyledons pop out, if that's about the worst time to get a really bad hailstorm. If you break that hypocotyl off as it's pushing up through, that plant's dead. You've got a stump there attached to the roots. The stump's healthy, the roots are healthy, the stump's still green. It might stay green and healthy for 2 or 3 weeks until something causes it to rot, but it has no growing points left on the plant, so it can't recover. If the plant was a little bit further along, and let's say it was up, had its cotyledons out, didn't have a unifoliate leaf out yet, and you cut that plant off right there, that plant's dead as well. The lowest growing points on that soybean plant are right here where the cotyledons attach. Now, as the plant grows, you've got the cotyledons, you got the unifoliates, and then you start getting the trifoliates. Every place where a leaf is attached, so here, cotyledons count as leaves as well, and up. So up here is your main growing point. If we could train deer or control hail so that it blew out the terminal leader in that soybean plant and forced it to branch right here, you could turn that plant into what we call a Y-branch soybean. Dr. Belo, who Adam worked with for years, has done some work with creating Y branches in soybeans. The way he did it is with graduate students with scissors. So if you've got a crew of graduate students with scissors to go out there and snip the top out of every soybean plant at about the V2 growth stage, I think is when they did this. That stimulates those axillary buds that are down below the main terminal to release. And what you'll get is a Y branch soybean, and it almost turns, not quite, but it almost turns every plant into 2. And we could raise 100 bushel soybeans pretty easily if we could make every soybean in the field Y branch at about V2. People that have experimented with burning the hell out of soybeans, intentionally trying to make them branch. That's a kind of a chemical way of it. It's better to do it physically than it is chemically, but it's a lot easier to do it chemically because you can just drive across the field and spray it versus going out there with a pair of scissors and cutting the top out of every soybean plant. But basically, any soybean plant that still has growing points should be able to recover from hail. Now, what we've been seeing in these severe storms, I saw this last year, saw it again this year, is this. So you've got your soil surface, you've got your soybean stem, and I say stem because that's all there is. And here's where the cotyledons used to be, but they're gone. Now the buds are still there. The buds are still alive. That plant's still alive. It's not dead. Now the stem might be battered and bruised and maybe even broken. And if you've got a plant with no cotyledons, no leaves, and the lower stem has been damaged, I'd say I'm pretty comfortable counting that as a dead plant. If you've got a plant with no cotyledons, no leaves, and the lower stem is still healthy, that plant's going to survive probably 80-90% of the time, but it's going to take so long for it to regrow and recover and initiate new growth when it's got no leaves or no cotyledons to live off of. A replant seed next to it is probably going to develop into a plant faster than that plant is. If you've got at least one cotyledon left on that plant or one unifoliate leaf, if there's anything left clinging to that plant, one cotyledon one unifoliate leaf, whatever it is. If you've got something that looks like a leaf out there that can feed that plant, I've got more confidence in the yield potential of that plant than I do a replant plant. So that's how I determine, do we replant hailed-on beans, or do we walk away for 2 weeks and let them recover? Don't look at them every day because you drive yourself crazy. But you need at least a cotyledon left on those plants, and you've absolutely got to have growing points. So if the plant gets severed beneath where the cotyledons are or used to be, I don't care how green and how healthy this stump is. I don't care how beautiful the roots are. I don't care how good a seed treatment you put on it. That plant's dead because there's no way for it to initiate new vegetative growth. Corn is a very different beast because until about V6, the growing point of corn is beneath the soil surface. So everything you see above ground in corn is just leaves. The growing point is down here beneath the soil surface until the plant's about V6. So in theory, you could cut off the whole damn thing and it'll send new growth up out of the growing point from beneath the soil surface. And you might lose the first 4 or 5 leaves. The plant will be just as tall when it tassels. It will have the same number of leaves on it when it tassels. It will have the same yield potential that it did before that happened, because the yield is being determined, late in the season by the crop canopy that's there during grain fill. The leaves that you lose from an early season hailstorm are the leaves that are gone and dead by the time the corn's waist high anyway. So in theory, if the plant doesn't die, if the plant can regrow, you've lost very little yield potential from defoliating V2 or V3 corn, even if it takes the whole plant off half an inch above the soil surface. And the textbooks will tell you that you never have to replant corn from severe hail prior to like V5 because the growing point's still beneath the ground. What I will tell you from experience is there are situations where if it's severe enough, and I think what happens is, I think that plant, takes a direct hit right here at the soil surface from a pretty good sized hailstone. And I'm going to say, quarter size hail or bigger. If it's little pea stuff, it's not big enough to cause this. But if it's quarter inch, golf ball for sure, or bigger, and you get just a direct hit right on that stem, I think there's kind of a concussion effect that does a lot of damage to that growing point right there at the soil surface. And I have been looking at some fields up in the Monmouth area the last few days where I'm surprised at the number of plants that I think are going to die in cornfields from severe hail. Now, some of it might be a seedling blight or some sort of damping off or some sort of pathogen that kind of took advantage of the fact that the plant was in a weakened state and may help take it out. But I don't think there's going to be a lot of corn replanted, but there is a lot of corn that is going to have some stand loss. And so the defoliation loss is not really what's going to hurt your yield potential. The stand loss is what's going to hurt your yield potential. So if you have a field of V4 corn that gets obliterated by hail and every plant comes back and 2 weeks later, you can't even tell it happened, I don't think that crop lost any yield potential because of that hailstorm. It lost some theoretical yield potential that you weren't going to get anyway. So let's say the field thought it was going to make 616 bushels. It now thinks it's going to make 516 bushels, maybe because of that hailstorm. Is it going to make 516 bushels? Probably not. Something else is going to come along later in the season that's going to reduce you down to the 280, maybe that you're hoping that the field yields. So we got so much room to play between the theoretical yield potential and the yield that you're actually going to get. These early season stresses, if they're deducting from yield, they're deducting from that theoretical maximum top end potential that we weren't going to get to anyway.
Lance, if we've got a field that has been beat up by hail, would fungicide after that hail be worth it on corn? If so, what's the window you would apply it after the hail? That's question the Ep11 20
Okay.
just rang in.
Great question. So, and it's going to lead us in, we'll kind of morph into, no, I'm moving too much. We'll kind of morph into one of my other subjects here, which is talking about early season fungicide. So I'm not as much of an ambulance chaser with hail, with storm damaged crops and fungicide as some other people are, but there is a school of thought that's out there that, hey, your crop has been damaged, your crop is under stress. What do fungicides do? They alleviate stress and they protect tissue. Well, if my crop has been damaged, I want to protect the tissue that's remaining and I want to alleviate stress. Well, in theory, a fungicide can help do both of those things. Now, a few caveats to that. I would say I've had better responses from fungicides making good fields better than I have trying to resurrect a bad field. So that's point number one. And point number two, which is relevant to the question that was just asked, is if the only thing that's left in your field is a stump and one broken leaf, even if a fungicide could benefit this plant, we're not going to get any fungicide into that plant. There's nothing left there to absorb the fungicide. So if you're going to, I need to quit using that marker.
Yeah, green marker didn't show up.
Can't see that. So if you're going to try to help a field of corn with fungicide, there needs to be enough plant material there to capture the fungicide. So you're going to have to let that plant regrow and recover to the point where it can catch the fungicide. So what I would say is, if you were planning to do a V5, V6, V7 fungicide application on your corn, I would still do it if it got hailed off. I would just wait till it leafs back out so that it can catch that fungicide. If you were not planning to make that application in the first place, I don't think I would do one just because it got hailed on. If you want to do some experimenting with that, if you've got fields where you had hail, I would do one of two things. I would either, if you're a believer in a V6-ish fungicide application, leave a round in the middle of the field where you don't make that application. If you're a non-believer in that application, then make a round in the middle of the field where you make that application. So either do most of the field and leave some undone, or do a little bit and leave most of it undone, but give yourself a side-by-side comparison and see what you see. Now, the risk in doing that is anything can happen one time, right? So if you do that and you see a 30 bushel response from that V6 fungicide application, don't assume it's going to be 30 bushel every time you do it. Flip side is true. Let's say you see no response whatsoever. Well, that doesn't mean it's going to be zero response every time you do it, because doing something one time doesn't really prove whether it works or whether it doesn't work. And you can see almost anything. But that's what we're seeing out of the hail damaged crops. Soybeans, I would not put an early vegetative fungicide application on soybeans just because they were hailed on. We don't really see a very consistent response to early fungicide in soybeans. We see a more consistent response to early fungicide in corn than we do in soybeans. So if it's a soybean field, I just let it go, let them recover. They'll come through it fine, assuming that there's enough there for them to recover with. On the corn side, if you want to do your early fungicide application, I still would, but make sure you've got enough leaf area there that you're capturing something. So relative to that, we'll have to cover that sensor up somehow.
So.
I mean, it's got something to do with where I got the board placed. I don't know. But anyway, the growth stage conversation in corn, Adam wanted to make sure we covered this. And if you've got your corn plant here, first true leaf, second leaf, third leaf, fourth leaf, here's your fifth one starting out, sixth one here. So we count collars, right? So the first leaf is the one that's like your thumb, that's got the blunt tip, rounded tip. That leaf counts. There's your second, there's your third, here's your fourth. Let's say the fifth and sixth leaves are coming through, but there's no collar yet. The collar on the leaf is like a collar on your shirt. Once you've had somebody, and we've talked about before on Ask the Agronomist, it would be nice if I had a plant and I could hold it up to the camera and show you what I'm talking about. And we may experiment with that some. But once you've had somebody show you what the collar on a corn leaf looks like, it's easy to see, does that leaf have a collar or does it not? To hear me say that, it might be hard to picture it in your mind. But if you've ever seen that collar of that leaf, it's just like a collar on your shirt. If there's no collar there, you don't count that leaf. So we actually do not count leaves. That confuses people. We're counting collars. Now we call it 5-leaf corn, 6-leaf corn, 7-leaf corn. Actually, we should say it's 5-collar corn, 6-collar corn, 7-collar corn, because 5-collar corn's got about 8 leaves on it. And if you're just counting the leaves, you're going to come up with something different than if you're counting collars. So the important thing is to count the collars. With fungicide, with early fungicide, I'm recommending that go on somewhere between 5 collars and 7 collars. Now, there's a couple caveats to that. If you're putting your fungicide in on that early pass with your herbicide, do not, and I can't emphasize this enough, do not apply your herbicide at the wrong time to make the timing better for the fungicide. Bad idea. I would also say, if you're using a herbicide program that needs to be sprayed at V3 or 3-collar corn, do not waste your money on the fungicide because the corn plant is too small to capture enough of the fungicide to do it any good. So we talk about V5 fungicide applications as though there's something magical about V5. The only thing magical about V5 is where the fungicide window and the herbicide window for most herbicide programs overlap. V7 might be a better time to put fungicide on corn early, but that does not overlap with most herbicide program windows. So unless you're willing to make a separate pass, which most people are not going to do, we're talking V5-ish timing for that fungicide. And I'll give a shout out to my coworker and buddy, Chris Carlisle. There's a really good field video that Chris posted. It's on our YouTube channel here. You can watch it. It's a nice, short, easy to watch video. Chris does a nice job with those, talking about these early season vegetative foliar fungicide applications. But that's our recommendation, is somewhere between 5 collars and 7 collars is the optimal time if you want to get an early fungicide on. And what that early fungicide is going to do, that's going to do a little bit of stress relieving. It's going to help suppress crown rot. It's not going to control it. It's not going to eliminate it. Don't go out there with a fungicide and say, well, you said I wouldn't get crown rot if I did this. That's not what we said. So we saw huge benefits of that last year where we had a lot of crown rot. Sometimes we see no benefit whatsoever. It's a fairly economical application to make, especially if you're hitching a ride with your herbicide program, then you don't even have any application costs. We usually recommend a half rate of Delaro is typically what we recommend. So it's a 4-ounce rate of Delaro. That's not very expensive. And if you don't have any application costs, a couple bushel of extra yield, you're in the black on that application already. Now, last year, in some cases, we saw 25 bushel yield responses, even higher in isolated cases. That's not typical. I would say normal is more like 3 or 4. And the range is, the least I've ever seen is 0. The most I've ever seen is 50. The average is probably more like 3 or 4. So that's the proper expectation to have if you want to do that V5-ish fungicide application. So let's talk one more topic on growth staging, because this is where it gets tricky. What if your corn plant is old enough that you can't tell if the bottom leaf is the first leaf? So little clue here. The lowest leaf you can find on the plant is not necessarily the first leaf. If the first 3 leaves have fallen off and are gone, and there's no sign that they were ever there, the first leaf you can see is the 4th leaf. So if you start counting at 1, but 1 is actually 4, you're going to be off 3 collars on growth staging that corn, which if you're trying to time a fungicide or time, even more importantly, a herbicide, being off 3 collars can cause you some heartburn. So you're going to have your spade with you. You're going to have to dig the plant up, and you're going to have to look at the base of the stalk right down here in the crown. And what you're going to look for is a line. And this area down here is going to be a little browner. And then there's going to be a gap here. And then there's going to be another brown line across here. So there's 4 nodes down here in the tip of the stalk that are so compressed together that you can't separate them. And then you're going to have a little gap here where you can tell this is white here, more brown down here. It's not brown because it's got crown rot. It's someday it might. But what you're looking at now is just that nodal tissue is a little darker than the white vascular tissue. Then the 5th node is up here. So the first node that you can see that stands out from the others, and then the 6th will be up here. The 6th is going to be pretty close to the soil surface. So these nodes are just a little bit darker. When you find that 5th and 6th node, then you can start counting nodes up that stalk. So you split the stalk in half. That's how you count these nodes. And then you get to the node that's still got a leaf attached to it. And by counting nodes, you know what that leaf is. So if you get up here and the first node above the soil surface that's still got a leaf attached to it is the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th node. So the oldest leaf still on the plant is this 7th leaf right here. So you start counting leaves at 7 and then keep on counting up. So once corn gets past about V6, if the lowest leaf you can find, if the oldest leaf you can find, if the lowest leaf, if you can tell it's still that blunt tipped, looks like your thumb, then you know that's the first leaf. But if that leaf is gone, the 2nd leaf, the 4th leaf, the 5th leaf, the 6th leaf all look the same at that point in time. You can't tell them apart, and you got to count nodes to make sure that you're doing it right. So that's just a mistake that frequently gets made, and that's why typically when you're growth staging bigger corn, if you're not careful, you are significantly underestimating the actual growth stage of that corn. Any questions, Adam?
Nope, no questions.
Okay, so we've touched on hail. Let's talk about weed control a little bit. So, and I apologize. I see we're getting into the 2nd hour here of Ask the Agronomist. We're going to keep going with this. If you need to log off, you're not going to offend me. I see there's 14 of you now watching me. If that drops to 0, I'm not going to quit talking. So it'll be here recorded, so you can come back and watch it. I got a couple more things that I would like to touch on, so we're just going to keep going here real quick through those. So a quick some comments on weed control. So I talked to a grower from kind of more south central Illinois a couple days ago, and he was sharing with me in his area, it has been so wet since planting, and there have been so few days to get a sprayer in the field. There's a lot of corn acres that have never been sprayed with anything that were planted 6 weeks ago. And he's got corn that pretty good stand, pretty good field of corn. He can't see it for the weeds anymore. It's buried in solid water hemp, basically, as he was explaining it to me. That's sad when that happens. We need to try our best, and I know he did. It was just a weather thing to not let that happen. And in some cases, some people don't really like to spray their before they plant their corn. They don't really want the planter and the row cleaners, especially if you're a no-tiller like me. It's nice to go in there and plant and then roll right in behind the planter with a sprayer. Well, where that cannot be a good program is when you can't get that done. And in that scenario, in hindsight, you'd have been a lot better off to spray it a week before you plant it and let the planter move your herbicide all around, but still have the herbicide on the field. So if you've got some naked fields that you've never been able to get an application on, corn or soybeans, get those applications on just as soon as you can. I know you're trying to do that. You're going to need to be loaded for bear on those because when you've got, he was explaining to me, he's got, isolated water hemp that are 18 inches tall. He's got a few more that are about 6 or 8 inches tall. And then he's got a carpet of small ones that are 2 or 3 inches tall. So he's got like 3 stories of water hemp out there already. And the little ones that are growing around those big ones, you're not going to get a full rate on those because the big dude's going to capture a lot of that stuff. And so, you don't want to be messing around with how low can I get away with on my rate. Make sure you've got a good strong mix. Make sure you've got probably some dicamba of some sort in that program, and take out all that water hemp. Grass is easier to kill post, but actually more damaging to your yield. So if you've got corn plants that are sodded in with foxtail, those plants are suffering a lot of lost yield potential because that plant is sensing the competition from those other plants, and grass plants compete with grass crops more than dicot plants do. So a thick patch of foxtail is hurting your yield potential of your corn a lot more than a thick patch of water hemp is, even though you might be more scared of the water hemp than you are the foxtail. So just do the best you can to get those fields covered. We've had a lot of fields that we've had to change up the herbicide program on because we had a good program planned, but we couldn't get it on before the crop came up. And after the crop emerged, we had to kind of go to plan B, plan C, plan D, something different. Adam and I have been talking about a lot of soybeans that are getting some residuals applied post. So some kind of delayed pre's, guys waiting for the crop to get up and then going out with that first pass early post, just burning the hell out of soybeans. Probably not going to hurt their yield. They might die in an overlap area, or maybe seedling blight will take them out. But typically that early herbicide stress, it looks bad, causes you lots of angst, but typically it's not really hurting the yield potential of your soybeans. Obviously, we've got a ton of post-emergence applications that have got to get done in the next 3 weeks. So, the June 20th date on our post-emergence dicamba applications in soybeans is going to be looming large. There's a lot of corn acres that need to be posted. Almost every soybean acre needs to be posted. Regardless of what herbicide program you're using in soybeans, you're better off to be too early than you are to be too late. It is really hard to post soybeans too early. It is very easy to post soybeans too late. These are not the good old days where all you had to do to clean up the field was bump up your rate of Roundup. There are weeds that you will not be able to kill if they get too large, especially if you're on a non-dicamba program. So mare's tail would be a good example of that. Even water hemp is going to get too big for Liberty to control, too big for dicamba to control, too big for 2,4-D to control. Water hemp gets, much beyond, 8 or 12 inches. It's going to be fairly iffy, if you're going to be able to kill that plant in soybeans. So err on the early side. If you're afraid that it's too early, if you're afraid that, if it's June 15th and you're thinking, boy, I wish I could wait till June 19th to spray that field, don't do that. June 15th is just as good as June 19th. Hell, June 5th is probably just as good as June 15th. Get the herbicide on, get the weeds controlled, layer another layer of residual on out there to give you that later season control. And if you have to come back on that field with another application after that, as long as there's no water hemp there, which in many cases last year there wasn't. I had guys that were frustrated and they were blaming that early application on the late foxtail, the late cocklebur, and the late velvet leaf that came up in their corn, or their soybeans. If that happens to you, do you know what works good on late foxtail, late velvet leaf, and late cocklebur that's not off label? Is Roundup. So you don't necessarily have to have a Liberty, a dicamba, or a 2,4-D in the mix if the only thing you're killing is foxtail, velvet leaf, and cocklebur, which tended to be the 3 species that were most often making fields look a little less than perfect last year. We did a great job on the water hemp with our residuals and with our Liberties, with our 2,4-Ds, with our dicambas. But the fact that we moved those applications up earlier in the season did give a little bit more of an opportunity for some of those other things to come up later, and your residuals, not going to give you perfect control of those species, But I will remind you that those species are all relatively easy to kill, relatively economical to kill. And if you need to make another later application, you can do that and still be on label. So speaking of on label, just a little reminder I like to make to people. Everybody obviously knows that the cutoff date on dicamba is June 20th. The cutoff date on everything is R1 soybeans. So whether it's dicamba, 2,4-D, or Liberty, those applications are labeled through R1, which is flowering. So technically, once you've got soybean flowers, we shouldn't be spraying anything on soybeans post-emergence. I know that gets overlooked by people sometimes, but that's what the labels say, and we need to try to follow the labels. So regardless of what system you're on, get those applications made, get that extra layered residual on. Don't rely on a late post-emergence application to give you a clean field of beans, because that's just playing with fire. Get those applications made timely. I mentioned volunteer corn briefly. I will give you a few tips on making volunteer corn products work better. So if you're going to use a clethodim-based volunteer corn control product, which most of them are, there are 3 things that make clethodim not work very well. One would be large spray drops with DRA, drift reduction agent. 2 would be a group 15 herbicide. 3 would be dicamba or 2,4-D, some growth regulator herbicide. So all 3 of those things antagonize clethodim. Now you can still make it work if you get the rate up high enough. But if you are making a pass across the field that you don't have to have, raindrop, spray drops, and DRA, you don't have a group 15 in it, and you don't have dicamba or 2,4-D in it, that would be a great pass to throw in your volunteer corn control product. If you're going to throw your volunteer corn control product in on this pass here, you're going to have to be at a pretty high rate of that product, and it will work better at higher water volumes, and it will probably also work better if there's a little bit of crop oil in that mix as well. But throwing crop oil in with all this stuff can increase your crop response from some of your other products as well. So just be aware of that. Volunteer corn management has become kind of a pain in the you-know-what, because we're making so many applications this way. Those volunteer corn products do not work very well, thrown into this mix. One more quick thing, insect update. I know I've talked to Adam. There's been some cutworm that have been bad enough to need to be treated in certain parts of the state. If you've got small late planted corn, maybe keep your eyes out for cutworm. If you did have a cutworm outbreak this year and you had to rescue treat for it, and you want to talk about, what are some strategies that you could use to maybe try to prevent that in the future, there are some traits out there that can suppress cutworm fairly well. There are people that actually preventatively treat with insecticide for cutworm. That's not a practice that I recommend frequently, but there are people that really believe in doing that. And then also just a shout out to our corn rootworm out there. Started seeing some fireflies, not terribly long ago. And typically when you see the first fireflies, that's about 500 heat units, which is about when the corn rootworm eggs start to hatch. And so corn rootworm larval hatches or egg hatch into larvae is ongoing now. We don't know what the rootworm pressure is going to be this year. Based on beetle catches we had last year, we would anticipate, on rotated ground, really no issues from corn rootworm this year in my geography. If you're corn on corn, it's always kind of a crapshoot. You can always have heavy rootworm pressure corn on corn. So if you've got, non-traded corn out there over the next 30 days, typically if you want to do root digs sometime around 4th of July is about the best time to rate roots for rootworm damage. So that damage is just starting to occur as those larvae hatch out. If you've got trait protected corn, wouldn't worry about it. If you've got non-traded corn on corn, not much we can do about that at this point. But that's that's something you'd want to keep an eye on. So with that, any last questions come in, Adam?
Nope. No.
All right. Nobody wanting to make it last 100 or an hour and 15 minutes with a late question. So
well, I would remind and ask everybody, if you like these Ask the Agronomist episodes and what we're providing here for content and information that's hopefully timely and helpful to you, hit that like button when you're watching. Whether you're live or whether you're watching later, hit that little thumbs up like button for us if you don't mind. And there's another hyperlink that says subscribe and a bell. If you subscribe and hit that notification bell, it'll give you a little notification update on your phone or your iPad or whatever type of mobile device you're using, and let you know when we're going live next time, which would be on the 16th of June.
Okay.
Will be our next live episode.
That's the day before my 22nd wedding anniversary. So you guys can remind me next episode that not to forget my wedding anniversary. And thanks everybody for joining. And if you have any complaints about the length of today's Ask the Agronomist, you can send those to jennifer.elliott@bayer.com and razz her about the agronomist that went an hour and 16 minutes today. So
Jennifer.elliott1.
Oh, one. Oh, we got two of them, huh?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
All right. Well, she's number one. So cool. So anyway, thanks everybody for joining us today, and we'll be back with you June 16th, right, Adam? I think that's what you said.
16th. Yep.
So 2 weeks from today, June 16th, and hopefully everybody has all their spraying done by then, because by then you'll have 4 days left to get your dicamba on, and everybody stay safe, and hopefully crops continue to look even better than they do today. So everybody take care.